both so much for being here. I'm really looking forward to learning about the exciting work you're doing within the space industry. I'd love to start by asking both of you to briefly introduce yourselves and tell us a bit about your current role.
Hi, everybody. I'm Tim Hughes. You would think I'd be better at technology. I'm Tim Hughes, SFS 94. It's awesome to be back on the hilltop. This building did not exist when I was here. I had a little trouble finding it, in fact, but love Georgetown University, so thank you for having me. So your question was, who am I? I have been at SpaceX for about 19 years now. Started off as general counsel for the company, and now I've achieved what every lawyer dreams of, and that is not practicing law. So I'm on the business side of things, and I lead our DC office and basically have leadership for all of our interactions with the U.S. government and international governments.
My name's Delian. I'm one of the co-founders and president of this company, Varda Space Industries. That, in some ways, when I like to give an analogy in the space industry, I always like to say that it's kind of going through like the AWS moment, that web and mobile went through, and call it the 2010-11 moment, where you have companies like SpaceX that have built infrastructure that now provide a platform that you can build on top of. And just like Airbnb didn't have to think about building their own data centers back in the day, now Varda doesn't have to think about getting access to space. We can focus on our own, sort of end business, which is in-space manufacturing of pharmaceuticals, and we leave all the rocket launches, basically to, SpaceX. And one example that I provide, even in the last 4 years, how much it's changed in regards to sort of working with someone like SpaceX. 4 or 5 years ago, if you needed to shift a rocket launch with SpaceX by call it 3-4 months, it was millions of dollars of cost. It was a heavy burden because there just wasn't that level of volume, rideshare, flexibility. Now, 4 years later, with the transporter program, you guys' Sun-synchronous or the polar rideshares that are coming up, we just recently, due to some DC-related regulatory issues, had to bump one of our flights by 3 months. And if I remember in the contract, it was on the order of $100,000 to shift by 3 months, which would have been unheard of a decade ago. Was still difficult 4 years ago. Now it's getting closer to one day it'll be like missing your United flight to San Francisco, and you just hop onto the sort of next one. But yeah, my sort of academic background is more in the world of engineering, computer science. Had a lot of friends that actually went to go work at SpaceX, sort of fresh out of school. I kind of went more into Silicon Valley world, startups, venture capital, but then thankfully sort of made my way back to space over the past sort of decade.
Before we get into the complexities of the space industry as it exists today, I'd love to invite you both to share with the audience what initially attracted you to working within the space industry. Tim, let's start with you. You joined SpaceX as one of the first employees. What convinced you to take the risk to join a first-of-its-kind private space company?
So I actually got involved in space because of the Space Shuttle Columbia accident. I was a litigator at a law firm, and I had a huge interest in politics, always did. And I had a passing interest in space, candidly. And I'm not an engineer. Wish I were. But I went up to Capitol Hill to work on the Space Shuttle Columbia accident, which was an incredibly sad event to try to unravel the causation and get behind how to fix the country's space program going forward. So I did that for a couple of years, and during that time, I got exposed to the industry. And from my perspective, it was an interesting industry because the technology seemed to be stagnating on the launch side. We seemed to be going backward, not forward as a country, and prices were going up. So when Elon was starting SpaceX, it seemed like a good equation to try to fix, or problem to try to fix, because something was clearly wrong in this realm, and it needed to be fixed. And so that was the attraction. Plus, Elon's pretty charismatic and compelling guy, and he had this vision, and we kind of rolled the bones.
Delian, you decided to incubate Varda Space Industries at Founders Fund. What motivated you to start this company?
Yeah, for me, it was, in some ways childhood dream to work on something in space, sort of classic sci-fi geek, read all the Asimov, books, and then, was fortunate enough to, grow up, in the United States and during my time in high school was when the first couple Falcon launches were, just taking off, and I just got so fascinated that this wasn't just a world of sort of sci-fi. It was something you could practically do. I was like, where can I go study for this and get involved in this? My plan originally was like, I'm going to go to MIT, for undergrad, do computer science, sort of robotics and firmware there, go to Caltech, sort of for grad school, and then go work at JPL. And I know it was honestly, again, like, Elon's success in some ways that showed me this sort of like alternative path where I was like, whoa, I can impact this industry by actually like, going into the world of entrepreneurship, startups, venture capital. And that seems to be a much faster way than like some of the, sort of as much as some of the planetary missions that, NASA does, including helicopters on Mars, are like extremely cool. Those time frames are just so much longer. And so I kind of got hooked on that whole world of, sort of startups and entrepreneurship. Decided to go out, into Silicon Valley, in like 2012. And I was originally debating, like, do I just go work at SpaceX? Do I go start my own company? Do I like work at a different space company that's earlier stage? And I kind of analyzed like Elon and a few other like, sort of major individuals in the space industry, Chamath, Palpatia, Steve Jurvetson. When I looked at like the patterns of their careers, they'd all sort of like made it big in normal tech first, and then like took that wealth and applied it to space. So I was like, okay, I gotta like discard the like sort of space, enthusiasm for a bit, go make it big in normal tech. And so I was like, I dove deep into sort of standard enterprise SaaS software, et cetera. And about sort of 4 or 5 years into that journey, SpaceX finally basically like landed their very first rocket, and I sort of had this sudden moment where I was like, the like Elon, Chamath, and Jurvetson career path made sense, before something like SpaceX existed, but now the barriers to entry have been lowered. I think I can just basically sort of do this now. And so I started off originally as an investor at Khosla Ventures, made a couple of sort of space investments there, and I found that as a way to sort of get my hooks back into the industry. Spent way more time with a lot of my friends that were working at SpaceX. And throughout this entire journey, I've just been really obsessed with this idea where, Elon talks a lot about making humanity multiplanetary, send sort of Starship to Mars. But I had always had a little bit of like a, I think of myself as a, sort of brutalist, libertarian, sort of capitalist. And I always felt like, the sort of Mars vision was, a great way to rally, sort of talent. But it always felt like it wasn't necessarily the most realistic path forward. I always thought that you sort of just needed clear, like, trading posts along the way where, if you didn't clearly have a lunar base or a cislunar gateway, or, in my opinion, really just like, more infrastructure in low Earth orbit, shooting for Mars was sort of too bold of a move. And the business model that to me felt like it was the one that really justified that type of like, human-rated large amount of infrastructure in low Earth orbit was always in space, manufacturing. And I wasn't the first person to think about this. There was papers in the early 60s that talk about the theory of this. There's a photo of, the current NASA administrator, Bill Nelson, in '82, doing a protein crystallization experiment on one of the early shuttle missions. And then, obviously a lot of the Dragon missions that SpaceX, flew had a lot of biopharma, sort of applications on the ISS. But, finally in Q4 2019, when, SpaceX managed to launch and land a rocket 4 times in a row, I called a bunch of buddies that were working on it. I was like, look, is this a fluke or a pattern? And they were like, this is a pattern. We'll get from 4 to 20. We'll get Starship online. And to me, it was like, okay, finally this business model works. But I just couldn't find anybody in the world that was tackling it the appropriate way. And so ultimately realized, I was like, my like last 10 years of my life, I feel like have all been culminating in this moment where I've reignited my aerospace, sort of passion. I've got access to capital right now. I have a business model that I think is going to be like massively impactful and nobody's doing it. Now's the time to start it. And then, sorry, but I did steal a couple folks from SpaceX, but, I think we're hopefully going to be a very large, customer.
I'm still stuck on the idea you were in high school when we launched for the first time.
Yeah, no comment.
I think it's helpful context for the audience that towards the end of the 20th century, the U.S. government deregulated space, giving private American companies access to orbit. The Commercial Space Launch Act of 1984 and the Space Act of 2015 removed restrictions on space exploration. Can you both expand on how deregulation of the space industry has opened the window of opportunity for the commercial space industry?
Yeah, I'm going to question your premise there a little bit. I do not think the space industry is remotely deregulated, and I don't mean that as a snarky way to respond. It's just that the regulatory burdens that we face as a company, and I know that you have personal struggles with these over the past many months, are quite profound. And I think that though those statutes enabled a bedrock of stability for the industry, and actually led to some investment, and then subsequent amendments led to greater investment and stability. They created a regulatory rubric that does not match with the current pace of innovation. I think we have a massive problem in the country right now on this front, relative to the space industry in particular, but I suspect it's broader than that, where the pace of innovation does not match the pace of regulation, and it is slowing things down. I'll just give you a case in point. We are working on a rocket called Starship. Starship is meant to carry Americans back to the moon. We're trying to move very quickly to do so. We're doing that for geopolitical reasons as well as contractual reasons and frankly, for tech maturation reasons. But we are building rockets faster than they can be licensed. Something is wrong about that and needs to be dealt with. So I don't think we've been deregulated, but I do think there have been great leaps forward relative to some of the skeleton is there to have a good system.
Yeah, I think I would agree with Tim that it's not deregulation, but I do think there's been some, let's say regulatory pathways that have been enabled. One that I particularly admire that I think SpaceX has done phenomenally well, and Tim, I'm sure you had your hands, in this quite a bit, was just, sort of the modernization and commercialization of Cape Canaveral. The fact that this was previously, sort of a range that basically only really had, government activity, sort of SpaceX cracking that open and being the basically first commercial provider to really operate out of there regularly, to then, establishing, what I believe is called the MOU or MOA that basically aligns the FAA, Cape Canaveral, and the private companies and articulates very clearly how regular launch operations should happen, what the interagency communication should be, who's responsible for what, and it now has enabled it so that you guys are launching, this year every 3.4 days, and I assume, sort of the vast
3.3.
3.3 days this year, and I think the vast majority of that is happening, sort of from the Cape. And so I really admired that in that now you can see that it's had a huge benefit for other commercial space companies, right? Blue Origin, amongst others, have established operations, in Cape Canaveral, and I'm sure their lives are much easier because of that. In some ways, I don't know how many of you in the audience are aware, but Varda's definitely had some level of regulatory challenges over the past, call it 6-7 months, where we have a reentry capsule that is currently up in orbit that was dropped off by SpaceX 8 months ago. We were ready to deorbit about sort of 45 days into that mission. It's now 8 months later. We've still not been able to deorbit despite the spacecraft being ready. And ultimately, the sort of the fundamental reason as to why is what SpaceX has been able to do on the launch side does not yet really exist for reentry. They're still not very clear. Where does FAA, have burden of responsibility? Where do the landing military ranges, have responsibility? And in some ways, your guys' framework is now what we're starting to pull, and I feel quite confident we're going to be able to make an equivalent framework for, sort of space reentry. So I'd say not necessarily deregulated, but at least they're starting to become more standard pathways, and it still really is the companies at the forefront that are having to break down those walls. But just like SpaceX broke down the launch walls, and now I think it's helping a lot of other companies. I'm hopeful that Varda will be able to break down the reentry walls, and I think that will help a whole lot of different companies that might also have very unrelated business models to Varda. As an example, like Sierra Space is trying to make a reusable space plane, and they have to go through the exact same regulatory pathway that Varda does, and hopefully will make their lives easier.
Yeah, the goal is not deregulation by any means. The goal is smart regulation, active regulation, robust and speedy regulation.
And hopefully learning from commercial aviation, since hopefully commercial spaceflight looks a lot closer to that pretty soon in terms of cadence, safety, and the number of spaceports that we have over the United States.
I'd love to dive a little bit deeper on the controversies surrounding the FAA, specifically regarding their diversity initiatives, understaffing, and lack of bandwidth. How can the FAA keep up with increasing demands?
So the FAA has a problem on this front, and it's becoming increasingly profound. And this is on the launch side. The FAA has regulatory purview over launch and reentry, but they don't have jurisdiction over anything on orbit, nor do they have jurisdiction over spectrum uses. So it's sort of like a bouillabaisse of different agencies that get involved when you launch and return a rocket. But the FAA itself on the launch and reentry part has a problem in as much as SpaceX launched 96 times last year. This year we hope to launch about 144 times, maybe 150 times. A few years ago, you would have been fortunate as a launch company, and we considered ourselves fortunate as a launch company to launch like 10 times. And so with the advent of reusable rockets, the cadence and pace of launch has picked up, which is a great thing. And so you've got that bow wave of missions that are being launched from U.S. soil, and they're being launched from multiple ranges, East Coast, West Coast, and now also being launched from Texas. We have a site called Starbase in Boca Chica where we're launching the vehicle I mentioned earlier called Starship. And Starship isn't even counted in those 96 launches. It launched twice last year, had some fiery endings, but it's a development effort. And so you throw development efforts on top of it. And then on top of all that, you throw the emergence of new launch vehicles that are coming into play. the United Launch Alliance launched their vehicle for the first time a couple weeks ago called Vulcan. They aim to launch that multiple times a year. Jeff Bezos has a company called Blue Origin that is yet to launch, but aspirationally would launch here at some point soon. And then there are at least a dozen smaller launchers, some of which have launched already. So when you add all these launches up, and you look at an FAA regulatory process that was really designed against launching reentry for 10 to 20 missions a year, it can't support it. And then you add the novelty and the complexity of new technologies and the need for speed, and it can't support it. So this is the problem that the FAA is encountering, and it needs to be fixed.
Yeah, we see it on a very sort of practical level where the number of sort of engineers that they have qualified to do what's known as a flight safety analysis, to basically analyze the technical data that a SpaceX or a Varda provides them and basically make a safety determination on sort of likelihood of casualty or likelihood of damage to property. They are just clearly having to sort of push back those analyses, and when they do them, and procrastinate until sort of like the final moment because they don't have the staffing to really do anything proactive. And so there's been sort of some discussions of like how do you create some sort of Space Force Reserves, FAA, loaner program where you start to maybe have some commercial engineers rotate into programs like the FAA to actually provide that type of talent and perspective at a much greater scale, and then realistically make some adjustments towards what level of depth they're able to go into, especially as you just increase the cadence of both number of operations and the net new complexity of these operations. So yeah, I don't know how much of it is some of the DEI stuff that you mentioned. I see that more in the world of like the commercial aviation and like the piloting things, and I do think we're in for a disaster in that world relatively soon. But the world of space stuff kind of sits in like a different part of the FAA, sort of AST, more so than where the let's say commercial aviation stuff sits, and that's where they have a lot more of the DEI wackos.
Since SpaceX has revitalized the space industry and made it possible to reliably launch payloads into orbit, a new crop of space companies has emerged. Planet Labs, Varda, Rocket Lab, Astra, the list goes on. What are your thoughts? I'd love to get both of your thoughts on these emerging players. Maybe we could just start there.
So you want my thoughts on our competitors? I wish them modest success. I don't know. Yeah, there's a phrase we use internal to the company about what we do, especially on the launch side. But space is hard. It looks hard, and it's harder than it looks. So there's a proliferation of aspiring launch companies and space companies, and it's a very difficult business. I would say that the launch side of the business is not a really good business for the most part. It is fundamentally finite. Unless you're launching your own payloads. And that is actually the track that SpaceX has taken, where we develop reusable rockets, and then, of the launches that we do, many of them, I don't know the exact percentage, but it's roughly half, are for our own payloads to deploy a satellite constellation called Starlink to provide high-speed, low-latency broadband around the planet. When you interleave launches for the commercial sector, for NASA, for the DoD, for international customers, with your own launches, it's a very good business on the launch side. But you're fundamentally growing another business for yourself. I think absent that model, launch is not a particularly great business, candidly.
I'll put on my sort of other business hat. So in addition to being one of the co-founders of Varda Space Industries, I'm also a partner at Peter Thiel's Founders Fund. And if there's sort of one question that we always ask whenever we're considering an investment, that's sort of one of our primary questions is like, how does this business become a monopoly? Because ultimately, we just don't believe that anybody really makes differentiated cash flows over the long term without a monopoly, right? Google basically has a monopoly on search. Microsoft in some ways has a monopoly on enterprise software. And my recent actually sort of argument to the firm, where to provide our bias, we're one of the largest sort of shareholders of SpaceX, very early and consistent investors. Even recently, sort of doubled down on the company. And my recent argument was actually that I don't think Tim's allowed to say this, but I think I'm allowed to, is that I think actually SpaceX is probably one of the strongest monopolies that exists currently in the Western Hemisphere. If you look basically.
This is false.
So my sort of rough analysis is if you basically exclude basically China or Russian launches, and then you basically filter it by rather number of launches, but instead mass to orbit. SpaceX roughly represents like 99.98 sort of mass to orbit. which, you know, in my opinion, basically there's that, and there's like ASML, which makes basically these like semiconductor foundry machines. They have about like 99% market share. Those are basically like the two strongest, you know, sort of monopolies. And so my sort of thesis on launch is, launch is nice when it's a monopoly business, but if you're not the monopoly player, going into launch, I don't think makes a whole lot of sense. And then, you know, the, you know, sort of companies that we get excited by are more the ones that look closer to Varda, Planet Labs, Impulse Space as an example. You know, Tom Mueller, the former chief engineer of SpaceX, now working on sort of in-space refueling, servicing, sort of taxi system. Those things are sort of built upon that piece of infrastructure we find very exciting. The likelihood that a launch player founded in 2018 is going to generate a lot of investment returns, at least with the investor hat. They might still make some launches, they might make some revenue, et cetera. But, you know, it's likely that they end up capturing 1 to 2% of market share, but that's not something that we find that interesting.
Do you want an opportunity to respond to that? Or should we move on?
Well, I mean, yeah.
No comment.
Yeah, no comment's probably the right thing. There's a lot of competition. There's a lot of competition.
A monopoly can have a lot of competition. ASML has plenty of competitors.
What's your next question?
This is off the record, right?
I would love to learn a little bit more about the major milestones ahead for the space industry, both as a whole and for SpaceX and Varda. And what do you envision the industry looking like 5, 10, or even 20 years into the future?
Yeah, I'm super excited about the future in this industry, and it's independent of launch, but it depends upon launch. So what do I mean by that? So over the next few years on the civil space side, with NASA, SpaceX is part of a program that involves a number of space players, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, SpaceX. It's the Artemis program, and it's the program that means to return Americans to the moon. And we are aiming to land on the moon with Starship, the vehicle that I referenced a couple times earlier, over the next couple of years. And we'll do it first with cargo, large cargo to the moon, and then we'll do it subsequently with human beings. And then we'll do it with regularity. And the goal this time is not flags and footprints, but it is to establish a permanent human presence on the moon. I think that's pretty cool. And it's a precursor to the capability to take humans to Mars. And that's frankly the reason that my company was founded. And I think it's very much within sight. And that would not have been the case 20 years ago. Probably would not have been the case 10 years ago, frankly. And then we're also doing it with reusable rockets, so that the economics of this start to become really quite realistic. And the technology is really getting there. So I think you'll see some major advancements really within the next 5 years that will be the type of thing that people will tell their grandchildren about. Very excited about that. And then running in tandem with that, the proliferation of low Earth orbit constellations of satellites is providing the capability for you to have high-speed broadband anywhere. And I joke with my wife, like, we've ruined everybody's vacation permanently with this, and that's kind of true. But like, we're really, what you're doing is you're enabling the proliferation of knowledge and information on a global basis in a way that is really impossible to stop. And that has profound implications for the world, and is very exciting. So those are two of the things we're working on. But I think the NASA project is really quite extraordinary and exciting.
My sort of biggest fear is that I really don't want to see Artemis turn into an Apollo Part 2, where you have this government-funded program that sort of brings humanity back onto another celestial body, but that there's no sort of real follow-up. And the way that I would sort of structure my argument for how to create follow-up is state budgets and state governments are responsible for pushing the very forefront, right? How do you get humanity to another celestial body? How do you make it so that sort of human life can survive for an extended period of time off the surface of the planet? But ultimately, the only thing that will ever make human presence off Earth sustainable is ultimately capitalism. And so the sort of one metric that I think about by far the most that needs to happen ideally over the course of the next 10 years is we need to be able to, as a species, send a human up into orbit that generates more value for customers down here on Earth than how much it costs to have them up there. And so that's partially why I've had just this deep obsession for in-space manufacturing, where as exciting as Starlink is, I have a hard time penciling out why Starlink would ever have justification for a human up there. I have a hard time justifying why Planet Labs, if you're observing the planet, would ever need a human up there. But when you think about manufacturing equipment, even the most automated biomanufacturing facilities down here on Earth today still require some level of human maintenance every quarter, every 6 months, every 9 months. And so, I really do fundamentally believe that, we are the most preeminent business model that has the opportunity to eventually get to a scale where, yes, we are fully autonomous today, there's no humans on board, but at a certain level of scale of our manufacturing equipment, we will require human maintenance, and then we can draft off of the work that SpaceX and others have done to enable, human presence in low Earth orbit, but now we can pay for that as a commercial service rather than just a government. And once we can justify having a single human in orbit that generates value, then you can very easily scale that to 10, to 100, to 1,000. And then once you have a 1,000-person city in low Earth orbit, it's so much easier then to imagine what does a lunar, sort of permanent lunar base look like? What does a city on Mars look like? But if you can't even get to the point where you can even justify one human in low Earth orbit, I have a really hard time seeing how we then jump from that to sort of permanent lunar base. And so I really obsess over sort of the sort of commercial need for there being humans in orbit, because I think just state governments and sort of passion from Elon's sort of personal dollars only go so far. Ultimately, the only way that anything really happens is just capitalism and commercialization.
The U.S. may be on the precipice of a space race 2.0 with a new adversary, China. U.S. agency officials have raised concerns about the threat China poses in space. China has said that space exploration should benefit all countries and humanity, and has delivered research devices to the lunar surface in recent years, including an unprecedented landing of a rover on the far side of the moon. What threat does China pose to the U.S. space initiatives, and what are the risks of other countries becoming spacefaring nations?
Well, China's really good at launch, and as you noted, their Chang'e 4 mission's been on the dark side of the moon for a couple of years, and quite successful by all reports. So I don't know that I would pose it as this necessarily risk-based dichotomy between the U.S. and China in space. Frankly, the U.S. and China do not work together in space. There's a Frank Wolf, Representative Wolf, passed an amendment years ago that precludes NASA from working with China. China's not on the International Space Station. They have their own space station running in parallel. That space station, by all accounts, is a pretty high-speed undertaking. So I think that the West and China are kind of running in parallel. I do think there is a race underway. Senator Nelson, who's the administrator of NASA, has highlighted the criticality of getting back to the moon first. But to some degree, there's the absence of the same impetus that drove the Cold War space race with Russia. There is definitely a space race, but I don't know that the stakes are at that inflated level in the space world.
I maybe would sort of slightly disagree in that I really do think that sort of space is the ultimate high ground. My sort of one-liner that I'll sometimes use is part of why I wake up every single day to work on what I do is I ultimately want the language on the moon that's spoken every single day to be English, not Mandarin, and that has less to do with the cultures behind those languages, but ultimately that ideally the moon is a sort of constitutional democratic republic and not an authoritarian genocidal dictatorship. And so I think sort of any advantage that sort of China has in launch, in space stations, and then eventually the moon is sort of disastrous for the rest of humanity. And while they have not yet sort of proven reusability, they've clearly proven an ability to launch at a significant cadence. While they have not yet gone to the moon, they've clearly shown that rover. And then I would argue in some ways in low Earth orbit, their space station does really sort of outcompete the ISS today. It's a much more modern space station. It has more payload capabilities. Clearly has a sort of lifespan that I can think far expand past the ISS. And at the same time, you're seeing right now, NASA's ISS, sort of program managers have this just real extreme defeatist language around their transition plan. 4 years ago, they talked about we're going to have all these sort of commercial destinations. Everybody's going to be working on it. Look how awesome this looks. Now 4 years later, you have Northrop Grumman backing out of the program. You have the ISS, sort of program director, talking about them being okay with there being a gap, with them having to extend this, sort of prior defunct station through the 2030s if they need to. And so I have this, sort of real, sort of existential concern that, we are going to get to 2030, and if, sort of, if NASA sort of doesn't get their I think priorities straight, I think you may end up having where Artemis turns into sort of an Apollo version 2, and they don't have the budget to sustain it for an extended period of time, and Elon's not willing to do it just off of his own dime if it's not clearly making revenues, and that our space station ends up being sort of 40 years out of date and ends up having to deorbit due to disaster, and all of a sudden you basically have the Chinese probably at that point having figured out reusability, having the modern space station, and having the sort of willingness to be an authoritarian nation and really throw both lives and capital at the process of establishing a lunar base or a lunar ice mining operation. And so I really do see it as something that's sort of truly existential. And I think the sort of next 5 years are one of those critical sort of steps of, do we establish a Artemis program that is truly sustainable? Do we figure out a low Earth orbit strategy that can actually beat out the Chinese? And can we continue to stay ahead on both cadence and reusability while I'm sure that they're going to be making some real progress themselves?
Yeah, well, I agree with you that it is critical and of paramount national importance to get to the moon first, and that is where we are singularly focused. Whether it's existential or not, I don't know, but I think it's a critical matter of national prestige and a critical matter of national technology leadership. So yes.
I want to circle back to SpaceX's stated mission of becoming a multiplanetary species. Elon's estimated that the cost to become a multiplanetary species is roughly $10 billion. I'd love if you could share a bit more about how SpaceX plans to generate revenue in order to achieve this goal, and also, Mars is largely an uninhabitable planet in terms of, if you consider its ecosystem. Can you talk a little bit more about how we plan to become a multiplanetary species?
Yeah, I keep a list next to my phone of people to send to Mars, and it's long. I'm not even kidding. So how do we generate sufficient revenue to do this? Well, that in part was the impetus for Starlink, our high-speed, low-latency broadband system. We now have about 2.2 million users for that system. So we've diversified our business to move from a pure-play launch provider. Well, I shouldn't say pure-play launch, human launch, cargo launch, satellite launch, and landing, to now really becoming a global internet service provider. Very, very different business, but it's one that is quite expansive, and I think has a really nice financial tailwind to it, especially as we look at things like direct-to-cell, where some of our recent satellites have employed technology to go direct to your cell phone with broadband. I think the market base for this is quite large, and the appetite for broadband is insatiable. And so I'm very happy with this business model and the revenues it will drive that we can throw back into R&D, which we have done consistently as a company, to build out technologies that have game-changing implications. And Starship is the exemplar of that. Though we're working with NASA, I can promise you we have spent far more than NASA has on that launch vehicle, and will continue to do so, because that is the vehicle that we think is the vehicle that carries large numbers of human beings to low Earth orbit, to the moon, and to Mars. So we think we can fund that on the backs of the business that we've established, and that's how we're going to do it.
Delian, you've said previously that Varda is differentiated from other space companies and that its primary mission is to bring value to Earth. Can you elaborate on this? And in your opinion, should companies be focused on bringing value to Earth as opposed to bringing value to space?
Yeah, I think when you ever see any sort of net new burgeoning industry, ultimately in order for it to become sustainable, it needs to sort of connect to the rest of the economy, right? So in early 1999, you had this internet economy that was massively booming, but when you sort of dug under the surface, it was actually mostly internet companies selling to other internet companies. They didn't connect to the rest of the economy, and so the moment that some of those companies started to fall apart, it entirely imploded on itself. And ultimately that was true with internet, green tech, and true in space as well, where I sort of always categorize there's sort of two types of space companies. There's space companies that only sell to other space companies, and there's space companies that connect into the rest of the economy, right? SpaceX obviously originally sort of started off as a space company, right? They're only selling to satellite providers, NASA and the DoD. And then in some ways, Starlink is the much more sort of sustainable and exciting business because now it's a sort of space business that connects to the sort of rest of the economy. And I think if you look at it in the ecosystem, if you ever really get beyond sort of 50-50 in terms of split of those businesses, you're probably in an unhealthy place. And so, Varda was explicitly obviously founded this idea of, our customers are like top 20, publicly traded, biopharma companies. They obviously know nothing and care little about space. They care about being delivered a better, sort of product and pharmaceutical, sort of drug compound. The fact that we go to space, is sort of a operational detail that feels, somewhat irrelevant for them. And so, when I think about the future of the space economy, I think you need to see a lot more. Right now, I'd argue there's really only two business models that have been shown to, have any success in this sort of space for Earth. It's basically internet communications and Earth observation. And, internet communications also being, call it 10 to 15x, sort of the size of, Earth observation. So in some ways, really, it's kind of like Starlink, and then the rest is actually mostly a rounding error in comparison. When you exclude DoD, national security, et cetera, emissions, if you look at commercial revenues, the number of like insurance companies buying photos of the Earth to like improve flood insurance, it's like a use case that everybody talks about. But if you actually look at the total revenues of what, even including the DoD, which by the way is the biggest Earth observation customer, the amount that the DoD plus all commercial customers in the United States spend on Earth observation is the equivalent of how much United States consumers spend on toasters every year. And so it's cool. It's a nice market to start in. I don't buy a toaster that often, and so it's not that big of a portion of my life. People buy internet subscriptions every single month. That's a much bigger portion of their life. People, go to pharmacies pretty often, so I hope that we can make that part. But unless space connects into much more of the economy, it's not going to be that big of an industry in and of itself. And so, I really do hope that, that first wave of business of internet communications helped us get a foothold and allowed SpaceX to succeed. And I'm really hopeful that, pharmaceuticals is going to be that next very large market that is, much more impactful than just toasters.
Amazing. As we're wrapping up, I'd like to ask both of you to share some advice with students who are interested in getting involved in the space industry. And further, do you anticipate the emerging space industry will provide opportunities for students and recent graduates to get involved?
Yeah, I mean, if you're a, electrical engineer, flight software engineer, analysis, like there are just so many more interesting opportunities. Like, 15 years ago, it was SpaceX or bust, right? Now it's SpaceX also has a massive employee base, and there's also like another 10, 12, 15 companies, if for some reason you don't want to go to SpaceX, that, also I think offer very interesting opportunities. And so, I think it's just like a very exciting time to be a fresh grad interested in aerospace, and that you can go, sort of exhibit your passion in many different ways. And then hell, even at SpaceX, there's a multitude of different, sort of projects that you can, sort of work on. And so, I think, my sort of one-liner to people that want to get into space is, well, you don't really have as much of an excuse anymore. I would argue, I think when I, was graduating in 2012, there was a little bit more of an excuse where it was like there's really only one option, and I felt like it wasn't the right option for me at the time. Versus now, it's like, if you're not working in space and that's the thing you're passionate about, I'm like, okay, well, there's kind of like 15 different options for anything that you're possibly passionate about in the entire aerospace sector. You should probably just dive right into it.
Yeah, I think that first of all, it's a super exciting industry to be a part of, and would encourage anybody who had a passion for it to dive into it. But you do need to be passionate about it. It is not without peril, and most companies fail as a general matter, but the attrition rate for space companies is really quite high. The internals of the company, there's this saying that we had early days, was that we needed high signal to noise ratio, and signal was somebody with an engineering degree, and noise was somebody with a JD, right? And so the value add in space is often driven by engineering. And so but if you don't have an engineer, it doesn't mean you're excluded. Or if you don't have an engineering degree, you're not excluded from this space. I would become an expert in an aspect of the industry. You've got to learn the technology and dive deep into it, even if you're non-technical or don't have a technical degree. But I would just try to become expert. And the best way to start, if you're really just delving into this, I'd read space news every week. Just get a sense of the markets, how they're changing. The new players, the new needs, and I think the world should blossom in this respect over the next few years. Engineering, helpful, but not exclusive.
We actually, this reminded me of a company that we recently just funded. I think it'll be announced in the next couple months. They raised, call it like $5 million. A decent chunk of that was from Founders Fund. The founding CEO was actually a woman that had gone to Harvard Law and basically decided to express her interest in space by actually studying a relatively new track that they have now, which is space law, because it turns out a lot of these regulatory issues that we talked about ultimately are policy and legal decisions that for the first time kind of do need to be revisited, and they largely need to be revisited by people that have JDs that can go collaborate with the engineers and understand what the needs are, but ultimately sort of translate that into policy. And she took that sort of policy background from Harvard Law and actually decided to start a company with a sort of engineering co-founder. And so yeah, I think as much as you may be considered noise, there's a lot more opportunity because there is just a much bigger industry now relative to 15 years ago.
Thank you both so much for joining us today. I invite the audience to thank our panelists.